Good evening. Welcome to everybody who's just gotten through the door. I see it took a little bit of time for some people to connect for whatever reason it is. Here we are in chapter 3 of Tanya, talking about how our neshama operates. That's what we're trying to work out. How does our soul work? It's a pretty good question, don't you think? It's something that we should be giving attention to on a more regular basis, probably. That's the truth. Here you are. You have a soul. It's really powerful. We've described the fact that it's a nefesh elokis. It's not just a battery pack for your body, but it's a divine spark. It's a chelek elokah mimal mamash, literally a piece of God from on high that's living inside of ourselves. And do we even know how to start it? Do we know how to use it? Do we know how to activate it? That's what we're supposed to learn about in this chapter, chapter 3. So last week we spoke about the fact that we are created in the divine image, and that immediately raised a big question for us. What do you mean the divine image? God has no image. It's one of the 13 fundamental principles of Judaism. Ein loi demus haguf. God has no form. So what are you talking about when you say that we are created in the divine image? How could you possibly be created in the image of something that has no image? And so we discovered last week that in the same way as each of us could choose to project an image to the world, we'd like people to see us in a particular way. We'd like to be appreciated in a particular way. And that's not necessarily the essence of who we are, but it's an appropriate image to share in a particular context. When I'm in a social context, one image. When I'm in a business context, a different image. So in a similar way, Hashem projects an image of himself, meaning to say a structure of the energies that God shares with the world. And that structure of energies becomes what we know as the divine image, and it's divided effectively into 10 different powers, what we call the 10 Spheroids. And those 10 Spheroids are in turn split into two groups, which is called Seichel and Midos, or the three mothers and the 7 pairs. And basically that's the template that our soul is modeled after. So that was a really important clue that we got last week, that our neshama is comprised of 10 facets, 10 soul powers. You'll often hear us talk about that in Chassidus, in Tanya. You'll often hear us talk about the 10 soul powers, right? So that's exactly what we're describing of here, these 10 soul powers. What exactly are our 10 soul powers? Well, they're divided into two groups. And those two groups are effectively, if you wish, the two main operating systems of the human soul. One operating system is called Seichel, our intellectual operating system. Through the course of Tanya, that's going to be a very important focal point. If I understand the intellectual abilities that my soul has, then I know how to really activate my soul as well as I can. And also, if I succeed in doing that, I'll be able to get to the next part, which is what we call the midos. Many people translate midos as emotional faculties, but a better way to translate it is the subjective responses that we have to our environment. Now, in this chapter, chapter 3, which is a short chapter, and that's misleading. Never look at the amount of writing in a chapter to try and determine how much depth it has. Never be fooled by how many pages you're going to turn. The depth of this chapter is massive. And what we're going to do over here is we're going to unpack primarily the intellectual component of our soul. Remember, if we know how the soul works, then we know how to activate it. For some odd reason, many of us in our lives, whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not, we're waiting for the soul to strike. We're waiting for that moment where the neshama is just going to switch on, and then we'll be inspired, and then we'll be spiritual, and then we'll be connected to all kinds of higher realities. It's wistful, and it's wonderful, and it's completely impractical. It's not how it works. The soul doesn't hit like a thunderclap on a broad, bright blue day. It's not how it works. If we want to activate our neshama, we need to do something about it. Judaism is very pragmatic. Judaism believes in stimulating change rather than responding to change. So if we could just use as an example, just for one moment, some years ago, we were sitting at our shul on a Shabbos morning. You know how it is. Many people come to shul to daven. I'm sure you're aware of this, right? People come to shul to daven. Many more people come to shul for the brocha after the davening, right? That's where everybody sits down, and there's food, and you can have a l'chaim, and it's social, and everybody really enjoys that. And in the Chabad world, you don't just sit down and nibble on some food or whatever. You have what's called a farbrengen. And a farbrengen means you have a l'chaim, and everybody lets their guard down a little bit, and you share insights, and you sing stirring melodies, and you challenge yourself, and you challenge the people around the table on real issues, and on real spiritual issues. In this particular farbrengen, we were sitting over there, and it was quite lively, and everybody was in a good space. And we were talking about the misnomer called inspiration, how everybody is looking for inspiration. Yes, if you could bottle inspiration, you'd probably do very well. Everybody wants inspiration. And in this particular farbrengen, I said, you know what? I don't think that Judaism actually believes in inspiration. Because inspiration is great, but it has no longevity. Oh, I'm so inspired. You think about it. How often in our lives are we inspired? I'm so inspired. I heard a talk, and it was an inspiring talk. I was sitting in Shul on Yom Kippur, and I felt so inspired as the Chazan sang that stirring melody of whatever, Kol Nidre, or Nesane Toikef, whichever one it is that really gets you. And then the inspiration became a piece of nostalgia. Remember how inspired I was? It was so great to be inspired. And then nothing necessarily comes of it. So if we live our lives waiting for inspiration to strike, we're basically in a very volatile position, a very tenuous position. You don't know when inspiration's going to strike. You don't control that. And if it does strike, who's to say that it will have any lasting impact? So we're strategic in Judaism. And rather than focus on how's my neshama going to talk to me, we focus on how am I going to speak to my neshama. So that's effectively what we're learning over here. We're trying to understand, how does this neshama operate? What are the different components? How do I use those components? How do I stimulate the revelation of my own soul, the expression of my own soul? So we start this process by analyzing what is called the intellectual components of the soul. Now you'll notice straight away, in this chapter, you will notice straight away how Chabad gets its name. Because the first three components, these intellectual components that we describe, are abbreviated as Chabad. So it's not just because we were looking for a name. You know, every organization needs a name, and you want something that's catchy and something that's easy to pronounce, right? Like Chabad. Ask any American Jew to pronounce Chabad, they'll tell you that it's very easy. You know, you got to have somehow either an Israeli background, or at the very least, you have to be familiar with Afrikaans to be able to say the ch, right? Why did we choose this name? Because it encapsulates the very essence of the philosophy of how Jewish spirituality develops in the Chabad model. It starts up here. It starts with what we learn. It starts with how we reconstitute our perceptions of the world. And it starts with the key component, which we'll learn about later in this chapter, of taking what's up here and making it real to us. But we're not there yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these three expressions, Chochma, Bina, and Da'as, which are abbreviated as Chabad. We're going to talk about how they are conventionally translated and defined, and then we're going to see how they are, from a deeper perspective, how they should be translated and defined. And that's where the magic starts to happen. So let's have a look and see exactly what he writes about it, and then we'll start. Then we'll start to unpack ourselves, essentially. So our question is, how do you activate your soul? How does your soul operate? So he says to us, well, we know that the soul is a reflection of God. God projects an image of 10 powers, so our soul also has 10 powers. The 10 powers that God projects into existence are split into two groups. So our soul operates in two major areas. Let's start with area number 1. Ubi'ur ha'inyan. The explanation of this concept works as follows. Now, initially, the very first time that you read this next sentence, it may appear as a tongue twister. And don't worry, because if you do find it to be a bit wordy, this is nothing compared to what's coming in chapter 5 when we revisit the same principle, and it gets even more tongue twisty. So this is how it goes. Ki hine ha-seichel shebenefesh ha-maskeles shehu ha-maskil kol davar. So if you're familiar with Hebrew grammar, you'll see that the root of all of those words is the root seichel. Seichel. You know what seichel is? Intellect, intelligence. It's a compliment when somebody tells you, wow, you obviously have a lot of seichel. Somewhat insulting where a person says, no, use some seichel. So we understand, we know that in Judaism, seichel means intellect, seichel means intelligence. So ha-seichel shebenefesh hamaskeles, the intelligence within the part of the soul that is maskeles, that pursues intellectual concepts, shehu hamaskil kol davar, which is the part of us that generates all new intellect. Are you confused yet? Nikra b'shem Chochma. That is called Chochma. And what is Chochma? Koyach ma. Now, this is a lot of jargon at this point. So let's step back and let's try and understand what's going on over here. First of all, we need to know that the word Chochma is a word that is quite familiar in Jewish jargon, right? Even if you're not so good at Hebrew, and even if you don't know Yiddish. It's funny because many people think that the word Chacham is a Yiddish word. That's because many of us come from Eastern European stock, and that's how we talk. We talk about, a Chacham. The other misnomer about it is that people often think that it's an insult. When somebody is not so smart, then people say, oh, a Chacham. Effectively, what you're trying to say is that they're not a Chacham. You're using it in a euphemistic term or in a cynical fashion. So what is Chacham and what is Chochma? Somebody who really understands Hebrew properly will tell you that Chochma is wisdom. And a Chacham is a wise individual. Somebody who studies, who dedicates their life to pursuing wisdom, we'll call them Talmid Chacham, a student of wisdom. It's a little misleading because very often in Jewish literature, we use the expression when referring to great scholars, we call them Talmidei Chachamim. And it sounds like, a Talmid Chacham must be a genius. Actually, Talmid is a student. It's a very humble position. A student of wisdom. And that's quite important to understanding what Chochma really is. So most people will translate Chochma as wisdom and Chacham as wise. We need to do better than that. And so we're going to define Chochma in a completely different way. Completely different. So let's talk for a moment outside of the wording of the Tanya. Let's just talk from our own experience. Let's say, for argument's sake, I don't know about you, so I'll only talk from my experience. I honestly wish that world leaders would pray the Amidah every single day. Because I can assure you now that if world leaders would daven the Amidah every single day, we would have long ago found a cure for coronavirus. We would have fixed up all of the global conflicts. We would have a robust global economy. It would be a fantastic world to live in. How do I know? Simple. Because I know that every time that I start the Amidah, I get the most brilliant ideas to solve everything and anything. Politics, medical issues, personal issues between families, faribbles, whatever you want. It all just the brilliance of davening the Amidah. And you know what the frustration is? It's highly inappropriate for the rabbi of the shul to be standing up in the front of the shul with a little notebook, even as tempting as it is. You know how good it would be to have a little notebook, like as those ideas come during the Amidah, just to jot them down? Because a magical thing happens. As soon as you take the 3 steps back at the end of the Amidah, 90% of those ideas dissolve into thin air. It's the most fascinating journey. You know, they tell a story about a fellow who he's davening in shul, and when he finishes the Amidah, he takes the 3 steps back. The rabbi comes over to him and he says, Shalom Aleichem. You know, like you greet a person who's been overseas. Shalom Aleichem, welcome back. He says, what are you talking about, welcome back? He says, I don't know where you were during your prayers, but you certainly were not here. You were all over the world. So I could relate to that, right? Why is it that we get our best ideas when we least expect them? When you're in the middle of the Amidah, that's not a time that you're brainstorming. You could very well have something that's been playing on your mind for a very long time. You're trying to find the solution. You've debated it. You've consulted experts. You've sat around the table with your team and thrown ideas back and forth. And you've just been stuck. Dead end. And then, when you least expect it, in the middle of the Amidah, or Lahavdil, in the middle of taking a shower, that's when the inspiration strikes. Why? Why is that? So the secret to that experience and why that experience happens that way is understanding what the word Chochma means. It's really interesting because if you have a look in Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers, in the 4th chapter, we have a teaching that says, Eizehu Chocham, who is a wise person? It's a great question. It's a really important question to ask. Who is a wise person? And the Mishnah suggests, Eizehu Chacham, who is a wise person? Haloimed mikol adam. There you go, exactly. Haloimed mikol adam. Somebody who learns from everybody else. And you know who the proof of that is? King David. Because King David says in Tehillim 119, Mikol melamda iskalti, I have learned from everybody who I saw as a teacher. Now let's understand that for a second. In conventional wisdom, what's a wise person? What's a wise person? The sage, the advisor, the oracle, right? Well, what's a wise person? A wise person is the go-to personality when you seek wisdom. So if you're stuck, you go to the wise man. If you're looking for guidance, you go to the wise man. So in conventional wisdom, the wise man is the repository of wisdom, and everybody else has to pay homage and respect because this is the repository of wisdom. This is the person you've got to go to. Comes Judaism, flips it on its head. Who is the wise person? The person who seeks wisdom. And he doesn't only seek wisdom from the guru. Haloimed mikol adam. The person who is open enough to learn from every person. Let's understand that for a second. So here's a scenario that I think we could all relate to. Or, not personally, of course. We could relate to it because we've seen it in a sitcom somewhere. So there's a couple. The couple's having a long-term marital issue. And they decide they have no choice. They have to go for therapy. So eventually they get past the psychological obstacle and they sign up to go to marital therapy. They come to speak to the therapist. They spend a good hour over there. Each one tells their particular side of the story. The therapist offers a few insights here and there. And they both walk out. What is the first thing that couple will say as they walk out after therapy? And this is 100% guaranteed, I'm sure, in pretty much every single case. What's the first thing they say when they walk out of therapy? They both turn to each other and say, you see, I told you. Because the nature of people is that we think the Chacham is the custodian of wisdom. And each of us believes that I am that Chocham. I'm the custodian of wisdom. And what happens when you do that is you get trapped in the wisdom that you already know. So one of the most frustrating processes in human experience is when you're trying to solve a problem. So you try to solve the problem. What do? You present the problem. You present a possible solution. Let's say you're working in a team. So you present the possible solution. A team member says to you, yeah, well, here's why that solution is not going to work. So then you beat around the bush and you try a whole lot of things, and guess where you land up? You land up back at the same point, and you try and offer a variation of the same solution. And that's what we do in life. As Einstein apparently said, if you keep repeating the same behavior and expect different results, then that's insanity. But we do. Consistently. We keep saying things like, I've tried so many times, which effectively means I've recycled similar ideas so many times. And that's why we get stuck. Because we believe that the Chacham owns the wisdom. And that's not Chochma at all. Let's use a different example. Let's say that you go to a talk. Let's say there's a subject that you're particularly interested in. It could be history, it could be science, it could be mysticism. You're really interested in this particular topic. You're well read on it. And so you come to listen to this particular talk, but you come from a knowledge base. You are already wise in this area. That's why you go into this talk, because it's a subject that you care about, and it's a subject that you know about. So you go to this talk with all of the stuff that you know what happens then? You walk out of that talk knowing no more than you knew before. Because you're so caught up in what you already know that unwittingly you start to filter whatever they're telling you through your existing knowledge. And then you know what happens? You walk out of there and say, that was overrated. They didn't say anything I hadn't heard before. You know why? Because the only things you could hear were the things you had heard before. Because you're so fixated in your own existing Chochma that you're not capable of hearing new wisdom. So what is Chochma? So he says, let's read it again inside. What is Chochma? He tells us, Ha-seichel shebenefesh hamaskeles shuhu hamaskil kol davar. The intellectual component of the probing, intelligent soul that is maskil. Now, you have to know Hebrew grammar to really appreciate this. Because we could use the word seichel. Seichel is the intellect. We could use the word haskalah. Haskalah is an intellectual concept that the seichel processes. But once you use the word maskil, maskil means you cause something to happen. So, for example, in Hebrew you say learning is loimed. Teaching, which is to cause learning to happen, is melamed. That's the grammatical form of the word. Maskil is to cause a seichel to happen, to cause an idea to sprout. So what is Chochma? It's the part of my soul that allows me to cause ideas to sprout. Now, there are two ways that ideas could ferment. There's two ways that ideas could appear. One is out of the blue. I don't know where it came from, and we've all had this experience many times in our life. I don't know where it came from. I suddenly had an idea. Listen, I got to tell you something. It's really, really good. You could be in the middle of a conversation, and while you're in the conversation, you suddenly think of something that's really witty to say in that conversation. You don't know where it came from. So that principle, that idea of a new concept popping into your head, that's Chochma. Almost the exact opposite of what people imagine. People imagine that Chochma is that you have wisdom. The truth is, Chochma is that you open yourself to wisdom. The second way in which a person gets wisdom is learning from others. Others could be in book form, or it could be people who speak to us. Oh, I've never heard that before. That's brilliant. That's amazing. Ever had that experience? So there you are, you're sitting at the lecture, and the lecturer raises a particular point, and you're like, wow, that is one of the most intriguing, insightful things I have ever heard in my life. It's so brilliant that as soon as this is over, I'm going to tell everybody I know they have to know this particular point. Now, what happens? What happens? Well, we all know what happens. This is what it looks like. Somebody comes home from having heard this incredible, life-changing lecture, and they come to their spouse at home and they say, you have to hear what I told you. It's amazing. What I've just experienced, what I've just heard. It's unbelievable. But okay, tell me. What? Well, it was an idea about something to do with Chochma and Seichel, and you can't get it out. You don't know how to explain it. Ever had that experience? By the same token, you have a person who has this experience. I've got an idea. You're in the middle of a conversation, and you've got this brainwave suddenly. This is going to save the company millions of bucks. This is the thing that's going to fix the logjam that you've been stuck in. You've got this brilliant idea. As you're about to say the idea, your phone rings, or somebody distracts because they barge in with a comment of their own, and a minute later, for the life of you, you cannot remember the idea that you had. That's the experience of Chochma. What we're going to discover is that the paradoxical nature of Chochma is, on the one hand, it is one of the most intense experiences a human ever has, and on the other hand, it is one of the most fleeting experiences that a human can ever have. Both for the same reason. Chochma, real Chochma, isn't mine. Real Chochma occurs not because of me, but in spite of me. Now that's hard for people to imagine. When I'm brainstorming, there's an issue and it's playing on my mind and it's playing on my mind and I keep rethinking it and I try this angle and I think about that perspective and I try from... If that's what's happening in my mind, it's all about me. I'm the one who has to solve it. I'm the one who has to call on resources that I already have and hope that the resources that I have, which may very well be the resources that got me into this fix in the first place, should now be the resources that help me to get out of it. Doesn't make sense. So Chochma is the ability to suspend myself. Most people are afraid of that. It's a very vulnerable position. It's also an incredibly powerful position. So if you notice what he tells us over here is you take the word Chochma, you actually take the word. The Hebrew words are always so carefully designed. And inside the word Chochma itself, you have the clue. So the word Chochma, if you take the first two letters and transpose them, you get the two words that he puts afterwards. You got it there on the second line in the quotation marks. Koyach ma. That's a paradoxical term. Koyach means power. Koyach means ability or potential. Ma translates as what? Now, usually when something is in a ma state, in a what state, how could it have power? If I don't know what it is, if I don't know what I'm talking about, how could it possibly be powerful? If anything, it's nebulous. It's ma. I don't know. I'm asking a question. To ask a question is a vulnerable state, not a powerful state. When you ask a question, you don't feel like the wise person. On the contrary. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he was saying that in the particular line of business that he's in, he deals with, he's a business person. That's his world. But in the particular line of business that he deals with now, he has to deal with all these PhDs and academics. It's not his world. And he says it's a difficult place to be where usually he feels like he is the least knowledgeable, the least intellectual person in the room. And you know what the irony is? That's his position of power. Because all of the people in the room consult with him because what they know isn't working. And his particular expertise is outside of their reality. So they're coming with their fancy degrees and the things that they've studied at Harvard and Cambridge. And he's coming from the hard knocks school of life, where he's actually experienced things in real. So here's this fascinating insight that to be the person who's asking the questions is sometimes the most powerful place. Very often much more powerful than the person who's giving the answers to questions. So what is Chochma? And why is this the first degree of the soul? Why is this the first element of the soul that we're going to unpack? The two ways that you could look at things in life. There's the way we look at things as people. We usually start from the bottom up. In other words, we start with what we can relate to, and then we try and develop ourselves beyond what we can relate to understand things that are transcendent, things that are sublime, things that are esoteric. That's how we operate. But if you're analyzing the soul, you should actually do it the other way around. Start at the top, start at the core, at the most sublime part of the soul, and then you trickle your way down until eventually you get to the more relatable parts of the soul. The highest part of the soul is the part of myself that is not stuck in myself. That's the highest part of the soul. The part of myself that is not limited to myself. As much as I love myself, as much as I think I'm an amazing person, as much as other people might give me all kinds of wonderful accolades and tell me you're fantastic, at the end of the day, I'm a very limited being, as each of us is. So the real power of my soul is not to be stuck in my limitations. That's Chochma. The koyach, the power to be ma, to be something undefined. The power to let go. So here I am, I'm under so much stress because I've got a particular issue that I need to resolve, and there's a lot that hinges on it, whether it be in business, whether it be a health decision, whether it be a family matter. And so I'm having sleepless nights, and I'm trying to work it out. Think of it. If that's what's happening in my life, if my blood pressure is up, and I'm not sleeping properly because of an issue, then I'm effectively actually saying, I believe I should be in control of this issue. And to be in a position of holding control means it's only as much control as I can hold. It's only as big as I am. Chochma says, let it go. There are bigger resources out there. And if you're willing to relinquish your sense of control, and you're willing to relinquish your sense of self, then you can actually key into these higher realities, these higher dimensions, which in the case of the neshama is even an infinite capacity for insight, for wisdom, for perspective. So Chochma is the maskil. It is the source. It's the factory that generates new insights. So perhaps rather than translating Chochma as wisdom, a far better way to translate it would be innovation. Because innovation is something I didn't expect. Even me, myself, I didn't see it coming. And in order to access innovation, I need to be ma. I need to be able to let go. I need to disappear so that the message from the infinite God can come through into my space. But if I'm the gatekeeper, and I'm like really very careful about what gets into my space, it has to fit my preconceptions, nothing can get in. So Chochma is directly associated with holiness. And we're going to see this as a recurring theme throughout Tanya. Chochma is not associated with academia. It's associated with holiness. For example, when the Torah wants to describe the Yetzer Hara, it describes a fool. Because detachment from God means a lack of Chochma. Or vice versa. The person who cannot allow themselves to experience Chochma is blocking themselves from God. On the other hand, the person who has Chochma is the person who's willing to say, maybe I don't know. The wisest thing that you could possibly say is, maybe I don't know. I once heard a good line. Somebody said that the most exciting phrase that you could ever hear in a scientific laboratory is not eureka. The most exciting phrase that you could hear is, that's odd. Because the minute something doesn't fit into everything that we have expected, that's when we're on the brink of discovery. That's when the world opens. That's when the divine can shine into our space. So let's go back. What do we call our great sages? What do we call our great leaders? Talmidei Chachamim. Now you could translate Talmid as a student in the very conventional way, as in somebody who sits and listens and takes things in. Or you could translate Talmid from the word lehitlamed, which means to accustom yourself, to practice. In other words, Talmid Chacham means these are individuals who consistently work on themselves to retain a state of Chochma, to consistently retain a state of surrender, of transparency. Who was the most humble person ever in history? Well, you don't have to look far because we just read about it this past Shabbos. So, assuming that the parasha is still kind of vaguely in our minds, we should know who was the most humble person that ever lived. Moshe Rabbeinu. What does it mean that he was so humble? What exactly does it mean? You know, some people think that humility is where a person says, you know, oh, don't make too much of a fuss about me. You know, I'm a nothing. You're exaggerating. You know, they downplay that. That's not humility. That's not humility at all. That's baiting for compliments. Humility is where a person says, I am successful. I am talented. I'm wise, or whatever the case is. And I know that none of it comes from me. I appreciate that all of these things that I have are gifts, just like any honest person will acknowledge. That brainwave that I had hit me. I didn't produce it. It came to me. That's an honest position. That's a person who's not going to walk around like some kind of a big deal. Ho, 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 I had such a big idea, such a brilliant... No, I didn't. I was fortunate that when the brainwave hit, I was open enough to actually get it. I was fortunate enough that Hashem decided that out of the 7 billion people on this planet, I'm the one he was going to hit with that particular inspiration. It's a position of intense humility. And because Moshe was in this constant state of humility, he was in a constant state of receiving from God, receiving insight, receiving depth, receiving spirituality, receiving instruction. And therefore the Kabbalists tell us that out of all the human beings that have ever walked this earth, the one human being who is the archetype of Chochma in this world is Moshe. That does not mean he was the cleverest man ever, because we're told Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, was the cleverest man ever. But what Moshe had, he was the most transparent person ever. That's why our sages tell us that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, spoke right through his throat. He was a conduit. He didn't block. The rest of us, unfortunately, most of the time, we're blocking. We're constantly blocking. We hear something new and we have a million questions. Is it good? Does it make sense? Should I be doing it? Does it resonate with things that I've heard before? We have a very difficult time being as open as all that. Chochma is our capacity for that openness. Not openness to every wind that blows across the world, because the world is meshuggah, let's be honest. And if you're going to open yourself up to every whim of what today's society believes to be true, you'll be a meshuggah too. But to be open to that which is higher, greater than me, that which takes me to a place that I believe is a place of discomfort. How could I ever get there? It is so high. It is such a great expectation. Think of the whole of Judaism. What does the whole of Judaism consistently do to us? Pushes us to that which we never believed we were capable of. You sit down as a Jewish person and you look at the list and you think, wow, 613 mitzvahs. That is an immense expectation. Nah, that's nothing. Wait until you see the details. Then you'll recognize that 613 is just the starting point. And you think, how? How am I supposed to do this? How am I supposed to live up to this? How am I supposed to learn Torah as frequently as Hashem wants me to? How am I supposed to be able to connect to every Jew and love them like myself? These are such incredible concepts. The whole of Judaism is predicated on Chochma. Stop thinking of self and recognize that there's an opportunity to transcend self. That's Chochma. So Chochma is an intensely powerful experience when it happens. At the same time, though, it is fleeting. That's why when you get that brilliant idea, if you don't immediately give it an anchor, if you don't immediately pay it attention, you lose it as quickly as you got it. That's why it's possible to sit in a talk, and while you're listening to the talk, it's like somebody has switched on the lights. And you have this absolute clarity. And you're 100% convinced that for the rest of your life, this will be a guiding principle. And by the time you get home, you don't even know how to share it in a cohesive sentence. That's why inspiration is a problem. Because inspiration strikes like Chochma with this brilliance and brightness, and then it doesn't last. So as important as it is for us to know that there is this trait, this element, which is the starter pack of the neshama, Chochma, openness to that which is above me, greater than me, higher than me, we're about to discover that it's just as important to have an anchor, some way to translate it into practice. Because if you're unable to do that, so you opened yourself up to the most incredible opportunity, and then you don't know what to do with it once you've got it. So straight away, we'll have to talk about what the next part of the process is. However, before we do that, we're going to see in a moment, when I say in a moment, I don't necessarily mean in a moment time-wise. I mean, in the next few words in Tanya, which could very well only be next week. So what we're going to see next in Tanya is we're going to see that there is a metaphor that's often used for Chochma, and it goes together with the next trait, the next element of the soul, which we're going to talk about, called Bina, which we'll get to. And they're often compared to father and mother, Av va'em. In fact, that's the exact language that the Alter Rebbe is shortly going to use. And it's quite valuable for us to understand, because in the conception of a child, There is a male and female component that goes into producing that child, into conceiving that child. Chochma is very similar in its behavior to the male component, and Bina, which we're still to learn, is very similar in its behavior to the female component. So in the conception of a child, the big distinction between the father's role and the mother's role in conception is that the father's role is relatively short. In order to produce the seed that's going to become this child, the father's input is fleeting. Very dramatic, a lot of energy, very compelling, but shorter. As opposed to the input from the mother, which is not necessarily as exciting and certainly far more long-term. The entire gestation, carrying the baby, providing the baby with nutrition. And that's exactly what happens. And that's exactly why right at the beginning we were talking about the idea, you can't wait for your neshama to strike. You have to have a strategy. Because when the neshama strikes, when you have that brainwave, when you have that what we call barak hamavrik, that's how it's described in many places in Hasidus. Barak hamavrik is like a flash of lightning, literally. So could you imagine you're standing in a dark room? Let's just imagine, for argument's sake, you lived in a part of the world, hypothetically, where some nights you don't have electricity, right? So let's just say that was happening, and there was a big thunderstorm outside, and every time there's a flash of lightning, for a second, you can see what the whole room looks like. And you can see where all the pieces of furniture that are out of place are lying, so that, you don't actually hurt yourself. But it's less than a second, right? It's a millisecond. It's a nanosecond. I don't know how long a bolt of lightning lasts. So suddenly you have this flash of inspiration, and then it disappears. If you don't have a strategy of what you're going to do with that, you're still going to bump into furniture. So you've got to kind of plan and say, okay, the next time that there's this bolt of lightning, I'm going to look at that particular part of the room and see exactly where's the safest route to get from where I am to that part of the room. Now, what happens intellectually is, when you have the flash of lightning, when you have this incredible inspiration, when you have this openness to a higher, especially a divine insight, if you don't have a way of tying it down and translating it into the hard work, which people don't really enjoy, right? We're not the hard work kind of people. Where's the download? Can I not just hardwire this straight into my brain? Is there not a way just to get the Tanya chip and you just upload it all? It's not how it works. As the verse says, people were created to work. That's how Hashem wants us. He wants us to work through concepts because then we come to own them. So the first thing is we have to be open enough to receive the concept, and then we have to actually do something to work with it. So if I'm going into a lecture, and I really want to get what that teacher has to say, I have to walk into that lecture, and this is difficult to do. I have to walk into that lecture and say, I will pretend now that I know nothing about this subject. I'm going to pretend now that whatever they teach me for the first time. The Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos says there are 7 things that describe a wise person and 7 things that describe a foolish person. Now, one of the things that they use to describe a wise person is Alma sheloi shoma, oimer loi shomati. Anything that he has never heard before, he says, he acknowledges, never heard it before. And then at the end of the Mishnah, it says the exact opposite of the 7 traits are what describe a foolish person. So let's do this exercise together. The wise person, ma sheloi shama, whatever he has not heard before, oimer loi shamati, he says, I've never heard it. Now the opposite is a fool. So let's do the opposite. Whatever he has heard, he says, I have heard. Okay, that's not a fool. Okay, let's try it a different way. Whatever he has not heard, he says, I have heard. That's not a fool, that's a liar. So what's going on over here? Can you hear the word for Chochma in there? Al-ma sheloi shoma. The wise person, when he comes to learn something, always takes an attitude. Maybe there's something I haven't heard before. Maybe there's some element of this story that I haven't learned properly. That's a wise person. So then the person says, Loi shamati, I don't know the subject at all, because maybe there's still something I don't know. I'm a blank canvas. Start again. I'll listen from the beginning. A fool, ma sheshoma. The second anything sounds vaguely familiar, Shamaite, I heard that one already. I've been to that shir before. We read this parasha last year. Didn't we do that at the Pesach Seder last time? That's step one. The practical take-home from tonight, step one, is to be conscious of our Chochma ability, the ability to say, there's a whole world out there, particularly of spirituality and godliness, and I'm open to hear it, even if it will run against everything that I thought I knew. That's where the real learning begins. But it begins there. There has to be a follow-on program to consolidate it, and that's called Bina, which, please God, we'll begin to study next week.